At 2 a.m. on Thanksgiving, I walked out of my family's multi-million-dollar home forever and blocked all their numbers. They assumed I was just being dramatic about a $2 gift. They had no idea I had just discovered they'd forged my signature on $5 million of fraudulent loans. Hey everyone, it's Alice. Before we get into it, I just want to thank you for creating this space where stories like mine can be told. Because tonight I'm taking you back to a Thanksgiving that changed my life forever. It was the day I learned my exact worth to my family. $2. The air in our Highland Park home in Dallas was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and expensive perfume. Crystal glasses clinked. Laughter echoed off the vaulted ceilings. And then, my sister Tiffany let out a shriek that cut through it all. My parents, Richard and Barbara, beamed as she dangled the keys to a brand new, pearl-white BMW 8 Series. To impress your friends at the country club, my mother cooed. It sat in the driveway, a monument to their affection, wrapped in a ridiculous, oversized red bow. Then all eyes turned to me. My gift was a small, heavy box. Inside was a cheap, ceramic piggy bank. My father waved his hand dismissively. Start your retirement fund, Alice. You've always been good at saving. I forced a smile, turned it upside down, and 2 single-dollar bills fluttered onto my lap. The silence in that room was louder than a gunshot. It was the moment I realized I was a ghost at my own family's table. If you've ever felt invisible in a room full of people who are supposed to love you, do me a favor and just type the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this story of silent strength really goes. This wasn't just a bad gift, it was a message. I know what you're thinking. How could any parent do that? The truth is, that piggy bank wasn't a shock, it was a confirmation. For 34 years, I'd been cast in a role I never auditioned for. The responsible one. My sister, Tiffany, was born for a different role. The golden child. Her childhood was a highlight reel of pageant trophies, equestrian ribbons, and a finding herself tour through Europe, entirely bankrolled by our parents. She was an expert in charm, floating through life on a cloud of charisma and my father's money. Any problem, any failed boutique or passion project, was just another opportunity for them to swoop in and save their brilliant, artistic daughter. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one. The one who got a part-time job at 16, who studied until 2 a.m. to get into the University of Chicago, who celebrated graduating summa cum laude with a deep dish pizza because my parents were on a ski trip in Aspen with Tiffany. My achievements weren't celebrated, they were expected. My independence wasn't a source of pride for them, it was a justification for their absence. I was the family's bedrock, the reliable, sturdy foundation they never had to worry about, which meant they never had to look at me at all. Every family has a script, you know, and everyone gets a part. So, let me know in the comments. Were you cast as the fixer who always had to be responsible, or the star who was born to shine? I'm genuinely curious to see the balance in our community here. This dynamic was the silent, foundational rule of our family. And that Thanksgiving, they just finally said it out loud. But even knowing the roles we played, a foolish part of me walked into that house on Thanksgiving hoping for a different ending. I thought this year, I had something they couldn't ignore, something that would finally make them see me. The first was a gift for my father. It was our grandfather's Rolex, a classic 1968 model. Dad had sold it during a rough patch in his early 20s, and had spoken of it ever since as his one great regret. It took me 6 months of scouring collector networks and a significant piece of my annual bonus to find it and have it perfectly restored. I imagined the look on his face, the moment of connection. When I gave it to him, his eyes barely registered it. He just nodded, said, "Oh, nice," and set it on the end table next to a stack of magazines. He never even put it on. The blow stunned me, but I still had my ace in the hole. My career. A place where my worth was quantifiable and proven. I had just been made vice president at a major investment firm in Chicago. At 34, this was the validation I had worked my entire life for. I took a deep breath, waiting for a lull in Tiffany's monologue about a ski trip. As I opened my mouth, my mother turned to me, smiled vaguely, and then immediately cut me off. "That's wonderful, dear," she said, her eyes already glazing over. "Now, Tiffany, You must tell us more about the new chalet in Aspen. And that was it. A restored piece of our family's soul and the biggest achievement of my professional life. Vaporized. It wasn't just that I was unappreciated. I was utterly invisible, an inconvenient interruption in the Tiffany show. I don't remember saying excuse me. I just remember the feeling of my legs moving on autopilot, carrying me up the grand staircase and away from the sound of their laughter before I shattered into a million pieces. I walked down the hall, a gallery of my family's life where my face was noticeably absent, and locked myself in the guest room. I stood in front of the ornate, gilded mirror, bracing for the inevitable breakdown. But my reflection stared back, eerily calm. There were no tears. My eyes were completely dry. Instead of sadness, something else was happening. A cold, heavy pressure began to build in my chest, like concrete being poured into my lungs. People talk about heartbreak as if it's a metaphor. It's not. It's a physical sensation, the sharp ache behind your ribs, the feeling of your own blood struggling to move through veins that have suddenly narrowed. And in that cold, silent room, a single, crystal-clear thought cut through the years of noise. You can't earn what was never on offer. Love in that house wasn't a reward for good behavior or achievement. It was a closed circuit, running exclusively between my parents and my sister. I wasn't part of the family. I was just the power grid they plugged into when they needed something. In that moment, I knew I had a choice. I could either die a slow death in that house, seeking an approval that would never come, or I could choose to live, for myself, starting right now. Have you ever faced a crossroads like that? A single moment that defined everything after? If you have, just type the word choice in the comments. No explanation needed. We'll know. The decision was made. I wasn't going to be their foundation anymore. I waited until the house fell silent, until the only sound was the hum of the oversized refrigerator downstairs. The clock on my phone read 2 a.m. I moved with a quiet purpose I hadn't felt in years, my packing a swift and brutal edit of my life. It was a declaration of what truly belonged to me. My laptop, which held the architecture of my career. The dog-eared copy of Meditations my favorite college professor had given me. My passport. And the restored Rolex. I slipped it into my bag. It no longer felt like a rejected gift. It felt like a rescued piece of my grandfather's legacy, something I was saving from a house that didn't understand its value. I left behind every photograph, every sentimental sweater, every hollow award for being a good daughter. They were just props in a play I was no longer performing in. Before I left, I walked back into my old room. On the perfectly made bed, right on the pillow, I placed the cheap ceramic piggy bank. Next to it, I laid down my key to the house. The transaction was complete. They had paid me my severance. Downstairs, I slipped out the side door. My 2012 Ford Fusion started without a protest. It had over 150,000 miles on it, every single one earned by me. Unlike the gleaming white monument in the driveway, my car didn't represent a gift. It represented my escape. As I pulled away, the house, already blazing with ostentatious Thanksgiving lights, disappeared from my rearview mirror. I didn't look back once. I just drove east. The drive from Dallas to Boston is over 1,700 miles. For 2 days, that's what separated me from my old life. It was just me, the monotonous hum of the highway, and a profound numbness that felt like a protective shield. The flat, endless plains of Texas slowly gave way to the rolling hills of Appalachia, each mile marker a small victory, a step further away from the person I used to be. I drove through Tennessee and Virginia, surviving on stale gas station coffee and the sheer, stubborn will to keep moving forward. I didn't cry. I didn't even allow myself to think. I just focused on the white lines on the asphalt, one after another. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, with the sun rising over the mountains, I finally made the one call I knew I could. To Brenda, my college roommate, now a razor-sharp corporate lawyer in Boston. She didn't waste time with platitudes. There was no, "Are you sure?" or "Maybe you're overreacting." I just said, "Brenda, I left," and she understood everything. Her voice was the calmest, most reassuring sound I had ever heard. "Okay," she said, her tone all business and all heart. "How far out are you?" "I'll leave the key under the mat. The guest room is ready." Pulling onto the cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill felt like entering another world. The old brick townhouses stood shoulder to shoulder, sturdy and weathered by time. They felt real, unlike the hollow mansion I'd just fled. When I finally stumbled into her apartment, smelling of 3 states' worth of highway, she just handed me a glass of water and pointed me toward the shower. For the first time in 48 hours, I let myself breathe. I wasn't an asset or a liability. I was just home. The first few weeks in Boston were a quiet haze of healing. Brenda gave me space, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't responsible for anyone's happiness but my own. To feel productive, I started sorting through a box of old papers I'd grabbed on my way out of Chicago student loan statements, tax returns, the boring architecture of a well-lived, responsible life. That's when I found it. A thick manila folder labeled Collins Family Trust. I vaguely remembered my dad rushing me to sign some pages a few years ago. "Just standard estate planning, Alice," he'd said. "You're the responsible one, so we need your name on the documents." But I wasn't just the responsible daughter anymore. I was a vice president of an investment firm. My eyes, trained to see patterns and risk, scanned the documents, and a cold dread began to crawl up my spine. These weren't trust documents. They were loan agreements. Default notices. Pages and pages of debt secured for a string of Tiffany's failed luxury businesses, a high-end dog accessory line, a disastrous artisan water brand. It all totaled nearly $5 million. And the primary guarantor on every single loan, the person legally on the hook if it all went belly up, was me. They had forged my signature on half of them. My perfect credit, my years of meticulous financial responsibility, had been secretly used as collateral for my sister's whims. That was the moment the ground fell away. This was no longer about a lack of love. It was a crime. Have you ever discovered a betrayal so deep it completely rewrote your past? Not just a lie, but a foundational deception. If you know that sickening lurch in your stomach, just type the word truth in the comments. Because that's the moment my story stopped being sad and started becoming a family revenge story. I showed the folder to Brenda. The friend in her was horrified, but the lawyer in her saw a path forward. "They didn't just betray you, Alice," she said, her voice like ice. "They gave you the ammunition." That single sentence flipped a switch inside me. The grief and shock from the past few weeks began to cool, hardening into something else. A cold, clear, calculated resolve. This was no longer just a personal wound. It was a hostile takeover of my life, and I was about to initiate a leveraged buyout. The first step was to secure my own position. I couldn't fight a financial war from a guest room. I hit Boston's financial district with a vengeance, leveraging every contact and acing every interview with the ferocity of a woman with nothing left to lose. Within a month, I accepted a senior analyst position at a prestigious private equity firm on State Street. I wasn't just rebuilding, I was upgrading. With my own foundation secure, the real work began. Every evening, my small apartment in Beacon Hill transformed into a war room. Brenda handled the legal strategy while I did what I do best. I followed the money. I built spreadsheets that mapped out my father's entire financial empire, every shell corporation, every overleveraged real estate deal, every hidden asset funded by the fraudulent loans. And to keep my mind sharp, I joined a rowing club on the Charles River. Every morning before dawn, it was just me, the rhythmic pull of the oars, and the cold Boston water. With every stroke, I wasn't just getting stronger. I was preparing to pull their entire glittering, fraudulent world under. For 3 months, there was nothing. A blessed radio silence. I half expected it to last forever, but I knew better. My father doesn't let go of assets, and as I now knew, I was an asset they desperately needed to keep their empire afloat. The campaign to get me back began, predictably, with Tiffany. A series of breezy texts filled with emojis. "Hey, just thinking about you. Miss my big sis." No mention of Thanksgiving, no apology. It was a transparently clumsy attempt to soften the ground before the real attack. I left her on read. Next came my mother. The voicemails were masterpieces of passive aggression, each one a masterclass in emotional manipulation. "Alice, darling, your father and I are so worried. My blood pressure. The doctor says the stress you're causing is just getting to be too much. Don't you care about your mother's health?" The old me would have buckled under the weight of that guilt. The new me simply labeled the audio file, performance, art, take 1, and sent it to Brenda. Finally, when all else failed, my father stepped in. No pretense, just a booming, authoritative voicemail. Alice Elizabeth. This childishness has gone on long enough. There are some family financial matters that require your immediate attention. I expect a call back by the end of the week. And there it was. The mask had slipped. It was never about me. It was about my signature. It's a strange thing, isn't it? When you can finally see the puppet strings on people who used to control your every emotion. Have you ever had that moment of clarity with someone, that exact second you realized their concern was just a tool for control? If you have, just type "I see you" in the comments. It's a quiet way of saying the manipulation stops now. They didn't know I saw them. They just knew they were desperate. And that's when I texted my father back a single sentence, "Tell me more." The trap was set. My father, believing I had finally come to my senses, took the bait completely. In a voice dripping with condescension, he explained that there were some minor financial issues and that they needed me to fly back to Dallas to sign some papers to help the family. And then, he made his fatal mistake. He tried to sweeten the deal, to appeal to the part of me he thought still craved their approval. "You should come back the weekend of the Dallas Museum of Art charity gala," he said, his voice thick with smug satisfaction. "Your mother and I are being honored. We're receiving the Philanthropist of the Year award. It would look good for you to be there." To show a united front. The irony was so staggering it almost made me laugh. Philanthropist of the Year. A man who had defrauded his own daughter to fund his other daughter's vanity projects. I hung up the phone and looked at Brenda, who had been listening on speaker. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "He just handed you the stage, Alice," she said. "And a live audience." We both knew it instantly. This fight wasn't going to happen in a sterile lawyer's office. It was going to happen in public, under the bright lights of the very society they worshipped. The next 2 weeks were a blur of meticulous preparation. Brenda finalized the legal dossiers. I booked a first-class ticket to Dallas and a suite at the Adolphus Hotel. And I bought a dress. A custom-made, sapphire blue gown, not a color of forgiveness or reconciliation. It was the color of ice and power. When I walked into that gala, I didn't come as their daughter. I came as their creditor. I let them enjoy their moment, watching from the shadows as they accepted congratulations, the king and queen of Dallas society. When my father finally saw me across the crowded ballroom, his face broke into a relieved, triumphant smile. He actually thought I had come to surrender, to play the part of the dutiful daughter for his big night. He even had the audacity to wink at me. The host called him to the stage to accept his award. He took the microphone to thunderous applause and began a nauseating speech about integrity, legacy, and the sacred bond of family. That was my cue. As the applause began to swell again, I made my way to the stage steps. The event coordinator, assuming I was there for a touching family moment, smiled and waved me through. I took the second microphone. The room fell silent, expecting a tearful tribute. My father looked at me, his smile faltering. "Alice?" I smiled back, my own smile feeling sharp enough to draw blood. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice perfectly calm and amplified throughout the cavernous hall. "I'm Alice Collins. I'm so proud to be here to celebrate my father, a true titan of philanthropy. He taught me everything I know about finance. For instance, he taught me how one can masterfully secure nearly $5 million in fraudulent loans under one's own daughter's name." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. On the massive screen behind us, Brenda, on my signal, replaced the smiling family portrait with a high-resolution image of a loan document, displaying my clearly forged signature. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a world breaking. That was the moment I took my power back, not with a whisper, but with a thunderclap that shattered their entire reality. If you believe that sometimes the only path to justice is to burn the whole rotten structure down, just type the word justice in the comments below. Let's start a fire. I placed the microphone back on its stand, turned, and walked away, leaving my father speechless in the spotlight of his own ruin. I didn't stay to watch the fallout. I walked straight out of that ballroom, didn't look back, and took a waiting car directly to DFW International Airport. I was sipping champagne on a red-eye flight back to Boston before the first news vans even arrived at the museum. The story, as Brenda had predicted, exploded. It wasn't just Dallas high society gossip, it was a national business story. Forbes, Bloomberg, the Wall Street Journal, they all ran with it. The narrative was too irresistible. The philanthropic titan and his perfect family, exposed by the brilliant, exiled daughter he had systematically defrauded. My father's carefully constructed image was incinerated overnight. The financial repercussions were swift and brutal. The words fraud and federal investigation are poison in the investment world. Partners in his firm pulled out. Lenders called in their notes. His entire $200 million real estate empire, built on a foundation of leverage and lies, began to collapse in on itself like a dying star. Socially, they became pariahs. Their membership at the Dallas Country Club was indefinitely suspended. Invitations to the boards and parties that formed the entire basis of my mother's existence simply stopped coming. And Tiffany? The BMW was one of the first assets to be repossessed. Her trust fund, tied to my father's now toxic holdings, was frozen. The last I heard, she was working as a sales associate at a department store, a cruel irony for a woman who had never worked a day in her life. From my quiet office in Boston, I watched it all unfold online. It wasn't vengeance. It was a market correction. About 6 months after the gala, once the headlines had faded and the dust had begun to settle on their ruined lives, a letter arrived. It wasn't sent to my apartment, but formally to my office, forwarded by Brenda. It was from my mother. 4 pages of elegant, sloping handwriting on what was probably her last box of monogrammed stationery. It was a final, desperate masterwork of manipulation. A cocktail of feigned remorse, strategic blame, and pitiful pleading. She wrote of my father's broken spirit and Tiffany's humiliation. She never once mentioned the fraud, instead referring to the $5 million as a misunderstanding and my public revelation as a cruel overreaction. The letter ended with the one line she thought I could never resist. "We are still your family. Can't you find it in your heart to stop the legal proceedings and help us?" I read the letter once, folded it neatly, and slid it into a folder labeled Closed Accounts. I didn't feel anger or sadness or even pity. I felt nothing at all. The emotional tether had been so completely severed that her words were just data. It wasn't a plea from a mother. It was a bad proposal from a failed business partner. I didn't reply. I had Brenda draft the final communication. It was a single, concise paragraph stating that all civil and criminal proceedings would continue as planned, and any future contact attempts would be considered harassment. That was the last time I ever heard from them. Closing that door wasn't an act of anger. It was an act of profound self-preservation. It was the moment I stopped being their daughter and finally, fully, became myself. For anyone out there who has ever had to build a wall to save your own life, just type boundary in the comments. It's a salute to every person who chose their own peace over someone else's chaos. With that email, the Collins family chapter of my life was officially over. A year passed. A quiet, productive, peaceful year. My life in Boston took on a comfortable rhythm. Work was challenging, my friendships were real, and the silence from Texas was a welcome balm. I was healing. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in September, a formal letter arrived from a law firm, this one based in San Antonio. My heart seized for a second, a phantom limb of old trauma, assuming it was another tactic from my parents. But the name on the letterhead was unfamiliar. It was the estate lawyer for my maternal grandmother, my Nana, who had passed away over a decade ago. I met with him the following week, confused. He explained that my grandmother, a sharp, quiet woman who saw far more than she ever let on, had always known about the family dynamic. She knew who was solid and who was decorative. So, she had structured her will in 2 parts. The main family inheritance, the one my parents had probably factored into their financial planning, was now worthless, entangled in my father's bankruptcy. But she had created a second, entirely separate and fiercely protected trust fund, funded quietly for decades. It was to be released to me, and only me, upon my 35th birthday, which was just a few months away. The total amount was just over $15 million. Along with the legal documents, the lawyer handed me a faded, handwritten note. It read, "For my Alice, I always knew you were the one who would build things, not just inherit them. Your strength is your true inheritance. This is just to help with the foundation." And that's when I finally cried. Not tears of pain, but of profound, overwhelming gratitude. Someone had seen me all along. $15 million. It was a life-altering amount of money. The ghost of my old life, the voice of my parents, would have screamed at me to buy a penthouse in Back Bay, a summer home on Nantucket, a European sports car, to acquire all the glittering symbols of success they worshipped. For a fleeting moment, I considered it, just to prove that I could. But the thought of replicating their hollow world felt like a betrayal of the woman I had fought so hard to become. My grandmother's note echoed in my mind. This is just to help with the foundation. She didn't mean the foundation of a new mansion. She meant something that would last. So, that's what I built. After months of intense work with Brenda and a team of financial planners, I officially established the Alice Foundation. Its mission is simple and deeply personal: to provide educational scholarships and pro bono legal resources for young adults seeking financial independence from toxic or abusive family situations. It's a lifeline for all the other responsible ones out there, the ones told their strength means they don't deserve help, the ones whose ambitions were sidelined for a more favored sibling. On the day we officially launched, I made the first donation myself. And on the wall of the foundation's new office, I hung our very first artifact. It's in a simple, elegant frame. Inside are the two crisp $1 bills from that Thanksgiving piggy bank. They're no longer a symbol of what my family thought I was worth. They are the cornerstone of a legacy, the seed capital for 100 new beginnings. It was the best and most final act in my family revenge story, turning the weapon they used to diminish me into a shield for countless others. So that's the story. It's been 3 years now since that Thanksgiving in Dallas. My life today isn't loud or extravagant, but it's solid to its very foundations. It's a structure I designed and built myself, not one I was forced to uphold for everyone else. People sometimes ask me if I feel guilty about what happened to my family, if my revenge was worth it. But I've come to understand that their downfall wasn't my revenge. It was simply the consequence of their own actions. Justice isn't always a lightning bolt from the heavens. Sometimes, it's just the bill coming due for a debt that's been accruing for decades. The real price they paid wasn't the loss of their $200 million empire. It was losing the one person who would have, once upon a time, done anything to save them. The other question I get is about forgiveness. And I've learned that forgiveness isn't a mandatory final chapter for every story of pain. You don't have to forgive the people who tried to break you in order to become whole. My peace didn't come from forgiving them. It came from rendering them irrelevant. It came from building a life so full of chosen family, meaningful work, and quiet joy that the memory of them no longer has the power to cast a shadow. Family isn't an obligation, it's a sanctuary. And if the one you're born into is a battlefield, you have every right to walk away and build your own peace. Thank you for listening, truly. This has been hard to share, but spaces like this make it possible. The world may not always see the quiet battles we fight, but here we see each other. If this story, or any part of it, spoke to the truth of your own journey, please subscribe and become a part of this community. We are the ones who build new things from the ashes.